Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. What if the biggest risk in your AI strategy isn't the technology, but the assumptions you never question? AI is moving fast, and for many CTOs, it already feels like the train has left the station. Boards want progress, teams are building, and yet there's often a quiet unease in the background. In this episode of the CTO Playbook, I'm joined by Jill Heinze, AI Trust Architect and founder of Saddlestitch Consulting, to explore how anticipatory thinking can turn AI risk into real competitive advantage. We unpack her 4 anticipatory AI horizons and why it's never too late to bring intention, humanity, and foresight back into our AI programs. I'm your host, Adam Horner, coach to CTOs from startups to enterprises, helping you lead with clarity, confidence, and strategic impact. If you feel like you're figuring out the hard way, you're not alone. That's why I created the CTO Playbook, a podcast and platform built for tech leaders just like you. Explore coaching, cohorts, and how you can stay up to date through the newsletter at thectoplaybook.com. Let's meet Jill and her AI Horizons Playbook. Jill, welcome to the CTO Playbook. It's great to have you here.
Adam, thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
No, I've been looking forward to this conversation because your work sits right at the intersection of technology, leadership, and of course, responsibility. And I think that's exactly where a lot of the CTOs who are listening, who people are feeling the tension right now.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's an interesting landscape with AI these days, isn't it?
And it's changing fast. But before we get into frameworks, I'd love to start off talking about you a little bit, because you've had a really unusual journey, starting from, was it academic librarian
That's
to
right.
AI trust architect?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, I thought I was going to be an academic librarian my entire career, very steeped in public service. But as one does, you get interested in different things as you move along. Libraries themselves are very technical in terms of the infrastructure that we need to catalog things, make things available to people. So I definitely got that bug through libraries, but really transitioned into private sector doing research because it's something I know about, market research, user research. And long story short, I worked for a digital agency where I got to see a huge variety of digital projects. I did the user research to really define product market fit and make sure we were designing things in the right way to support users. And I love it. Once AI hit the scene, I was deeply involved in our company's AI governance. I started that function up and developed some responsible AI framework. So it's been a lot of fun, but it's really all been driven by, I care about people who are using the technology. That's who I feel I work for. And so that's been a real driving force for me.
Yeah, people first is something that I hold to as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the journey that's come along, because AI seems to sort of popped out of nowhere for many people. 3 years ago, suddenly here we are in the land of Gen AI, and things changed very rapidly after that. But I'm curious to hear, what were you doing before AI became unavoidable?
Yeah, I was doing the, standard digital product development kind of things. I was doing a lot of customer discovery, usability testing, working with cross-functional teams to build things for our clients who spanned, different industries, electric vehicles, banks, all kinds of really unique spaces. But when generative AI came on the scene, it really dawned on me that this is profoundly different. Like, we've talked about AI in terms of rules-based, recommendation engines. That's always been part of things we consider, but it really struck me that this is a whole new animal. The first time I used ChatGPT was really eye-opening. I'll say that.
And was that the moment when you sort of thought, this is going to change things forever?
I did. And at the time, I remember vividly playing with ChatGPT thinking, wow, this is amazing, but oh my gosh, is it powerful? And what does this even mean? So it forced me to take a step back, and eventually kind of my interest in how we move forward responsibly translated through the organization, but it wasn't an immediate, easy sell to get people to think about the potential downsides.
No, indeed. And here we are 5 versions later, and there are still people who are grappling with that. Now, you've worked in that time with, as you just mentioned, a wide variety of industry verticals and people within that. Fortune 500s, government committees, and now by the looks of mid-sized organizations. But what were the sort of the patterns that you saw beginning to repeat themselves across this massive variety of different organizations?
Yeah, I bet these won't surprise you, Adam, but a lot of it is we need to be first, we need to be fast, we need to adopt and sort of ask questions later. And particularly at that time, and being in an agency, it was part of our accountability to be a bit ahead of the technology so we could advise, our clients reasonably. But that's a tough order when things are changing rapidly. The technology itself, honestly, is not even fully understood by experts in the space. We don't even really know how it works. Layering new technology onto these new problem spaces, and the uncertainty is quite substantial. Not that that should paralyze us, but it's definitely something to be a bit humble about, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think when it comes down to sort of behaviors and decisions, these things are, they're complex to start with. The way we think about them is complex. And of course, then you add in all the human elements to that, and it's just necessarily going to be relatively complex. Now, you described transforming AI risk into competitive advantage, which is something I find a very interesting claim, quite a strong claim, because most people don't necessarily think about risk as being an advantage.
No.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm a bit of an anomaly in that way. And I will say, when we talk a little bit about speed bumps along the way, my enthusiasm for understanding risk can be misinterpreted. So I did have to scale that. But what I find really empowering, and a lot of the risk, Adam, that I uncover is through doing research with actual end users. A lot of times we just discover things we never would have anticipated if we didn't take a moment to step back, really think about the use cases, the individuals involved with them. And it never fails to surprise me how something fairly well thought through and well-intentioned could potentially go sideways for some folks. And that, to me, is super empowering. That's where one can say, hey, we understand where this could go astray. And not only that, we are going to correct for it. And maybe we tout that as the thing that we are known for because, hey, we've solved a problem, anticipated something no one else saw coming. So I find that to be very energizing, and it helps our confidence as teams kind of moving forward, knowing, okay, we understand the space that we're playing in. And I think it reduces a lot of friction, even in the development and deployment of technology as well.
Right. So essentially, it's taking that element of, oops, something went wrong. We saw it before it was coming and mitigated it before anybody else did. So that's kind of speed to market you're talking about from your agency days, carried through the risk element into being something that you're just ahead of the competition in terms of their thinking about it, approaching it, and actually dealing with it.
Absolutely. And not only are you ahead of it, and it's not just about risk mitigation, but if you understand the risk fully enough, you have identified potentially a new problem that no one has solved, and therefore it can be an innovation. So I can give a very quick example. It's a small example, but sometimes this is how these insights manifest. I was doing user research on an app for med students to study. As you may know, they have to cram so much information into their brains, and they're constantly reciting facts to themselves. So one of our ideas for how AI could be helpful in that context is to have a tool where they could read these texts and then sort of be quizzed about them. It's very common in these apps, but we had a number of students say, please do not introduce another way that we are evaluating ourselves in this tool because we are constantly stressed. It's causing us emotional distress to text in this way all of the time. So that's a huge insight to say, if we did use AI, what if we made it a supportive tutor or someone an encouraging voice in this journey? Now, we didn't actually go that far, but that's an example of how one sliver of insight can really shape a product in a totally new direction.
Got it. Yes. Really taking advantage of the gap you've seen
and
right. Exploiting it rather than just papering over it.
That's right.
And I want to pause on that word advantage because most boards that I see don't talk about AI that way yet. They sort of talk about speed, fear of missing out, competitor pressure. So one of the things I wanted to do is just sort of scoot back a bit to some of the early days. And when you were sort of first helping organizations with AI decision making, what were some of the things that genuinely surprised you when you were looking at the challenges, the problems, but also those opportunities you're talking about?
Yes. So and this, I don't know if it should have surprised me or not, but it certainly did. Which is in the early days when I was trying to make the case that we need to evaluate risk as part of every single generative AI proof of concept or any other project that we're doing with a client, it was not an easy sell because it read as, hey, you're putting the brakes on things. You are perhaps conveying a bit of cynicism about the technology, and that's not where we want to be. Although, again, not true. But I became very familiar with the NIST AI risk management framework and used that as a springboard to evaluate any kind of proof of concept we were experimenting with. And what surprised me, as we implemented this with teams, and we were partnering again with these Fortune 500 companies, high-risk industries, we would go through very simple exercises where we did a bit of empathy mapping, that is putting yourself in your user's shoes and kind of imagining what they're dealing with, and then mapping those to the potential risks that NIST outlines. And it was amazing to me that team after team would say, you know what? I never thought about that. We were so busy trying to figure out the technical problem, which is totally reasonable, but I was just surprised at the level to which people were not anticipating, oh, that could be a problem. Let's do something about that before we deploy and maybe build our architecture a little bit differently in light of this finding. So that was a big for me.
So just simply walking through an empathy exercise. I mean, I say simply, it's not always that easy to get into the mind of your user, but certainly a relatively straightforward exercise to take part in.
Absolutely. It was, maybe hour and a half of really thinking about the ways our intentions could go sideways given the use case. And gosh, it paid off so much because now we have new technical requirements built in that are derived from potential harms. And that, again, I think is a very empowering and differentiating approach to building technology.
And it's something that we arguably should have been doing all along anyway. So it sounds like good practice, whether you put the AI in there or not.
Absolutely. Yes.
And what did you personally underestimate when it comes to identifying AI risks or mitigating them?
I think in this new paradigm, specifically with generative AI and looking at agentic AI, I think what I struggle with a bit still is that there are some risks that are endemic to the technology. I'm not an AI researcher. I'm not claiming to be, but I certainly read and follow many of them. And there are some things like prompt injections, breaking guardrails. They are just kind of facts about this technology that have been longstanding problems. So the question then that I kind of grapple with in advising clients is, what are the acceptable use cases given your risk tolerances and your values that you're willing to take on knowing this about the technology? So yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, and it is because it's quite organizational specific. And as you say, thoroughly natural to the actual product itself. It is by definition a stochastic, a random product.
Yes.
And so that you will always have an element of randomness in there.
Absolutely. And I think people forget that. They really do.
It does seem to become reliable, especially with the sort of the newer versions of it. It's so often so accurate that every now and again, when you do get a surprising result these days, it is quite a shock actually at times.
It is. Yeah, I know. And that's perhaps the risk there of overconfidence, over-reliance. And when those things do pop up, do they even stand out to us? Should they? And these are just questions that I think are relatively new to grapple with, but are still, quite important.
I've seen a few simple, interesting scenarios, many of them publicized on the internet. Ask the AI this particular thing and you get some funny, interesting, different, unexpected results. But have you seen some of those moments where something nearly went wrong? Not necessarily a catastrophe, not a sort of a major PR disaster, but a close call.
Yeah, I have, working with teams. And this was sort of a turning point for getting buy-in on governance, which is we had a team that just didn't put any guardrails in whatsoever into a chatbot implementation. And obviously, we caught it before it went to production, these kinds of things, but it was illuminating to know where, particularly early on with agentic LLMs, where our teams were with understanding the nuances of the technology. We were all learning together. So of course, these things are going to come up, but we hadn't anticipated or given folks the infrastructure to develop their understanding and prevent these things from happening. So when something like that comes almost to fruition, it really was a wake-up call to say, okay, we need to step back and really make sure folks are supported, educated, and we have processes that account for these differences.
And I guess that, as you said, that sort of made the case for your involvement in your work that you've been doing ever since then. So it's obviously a fairly strong one. But I mean, do you think now that most teams get this kind of no system prompt, basic guardrails prompt into their fundamental, do you think most teams get this right now? Do you think there is a relatively good set of examples for people to follow? Or do you still regularly see, oops, totally forgot to put anything around a basic AI interface?
Yeah, it's uneven, and it also depends on what you mean by team. So it's interesting because, in working with one of my clients, I was working with the product team who was really still even thinking about data security. What happens when I enter a prompt into the system? How is my data protected? What are the best strategies for prompting? Whereas the tech teams were actually building AI-enabled software. So there was really a huge discrepancy in the understanding and skill set within those groups, which is a case for cross-disciplinary sort of information sharing and so forth. So it's hard to characterize, but I am in talking with CTOs and other leaders, knowing their concerns, they come down a lot to those fundamentals, which is also a surprise to me. It's not necessarily the nuances of the technology, but it's really like, are people bringing their AI to work and exposing IP and things of that nature? So I think a lot of folks are still in that place.
So the basic digital hygiene in many places.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot. So we are both further ahead than many of us may think we are, and we're also further behind. So it's a little bit of a push-pull right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think I remember from one of the projects I was working on years ago where this is before Gen AI, but it was a decision support system. So relying on data in order to help operators this platform to make decisions on behalf of members of the public in this case. And one of the things that we had was partitioned data. So different users had access to different partitions of the data. And thankfully, we caught this before it went live, but it was a situation where a particular user may, down to their rights, have a small or biased section of the data to be forming their decision support system from. And the only way we got to the point where we could help with that is basically to have somebody else look at it, and it was sort of second level of approval. And have you found similar approaches where taking a very simple human approach to maybe double checking something, maybe having an extra human step in the process has made significant differences to the risks?
Yeah, I think it definitely makes a difference in terms of, and you can look in the news right now, there's a real attention from a regulatory perspective on protecting youth with respect to these large language models, these general purpose models. And that's because they are a more vulnerable population. So one of the things I always advise when we are doing these sort of pre-mortems, if you will, or anticipatory design sessions is who is most vulnerable among our target audience. And let's think a bit about sort of the worst case scenario. But I'm also glad that you brought up data, because I have partnered with a data scientist, just recognizing just how critical it is to ask good questions about, bias that's inherent in every single data set that was collected for reasons. And so applying a human lens to that, we've had a lot of good conversations around just because something is measurable, it doesn't mean it's meaningful to the user. It doesn't mean that they can readily interpret and apply the results. And maybe AI isn't the best fit in every case. So I think in terms of how people engage with data, there's a lot to be learned by thinking about the lived context in which people are using these technologies.
Yeah, because I think it's easy to sort of think, okay, I've got a lot of data, therefore I can use it. But in some cases, actually, the data might be a result of another process. I saw a system a while ago where it was essentially a rules-based system. And the rules said, if this, then that, if that, then the other. They'd done as a team is they'd collected all of the results of these decisions on the back of it. And we're using that as training data. And I was thinking, hang on a minute, let's go back to the basic rules because that's going to tell you the definitive result rather than having something train on effectively rules-based derived set of data. And I think getting data provenance and understanding data where it comes from, I think is an important part of, as you said, anticipating some of those AI challenges. It's probably a good point there to actually now introduce your anticipatory AI horizons and talk about that framework.
Yeah.
So what I like to sort of manage from vantage points rather than steps or stages. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Why is that?
Checklists can, perpetuate this sense of false confidence. And that's definitely, as a trust architect, something I want to avoid. I think, as we talked about, a little bit of humility is merited with the technology itself, how we don't fully understand in all cases what it is that we're wielding in terms of artificial intelligence. And so there's a lot more integrity around admitting that we need to understand where we are now and we need to look ahead, and we're not going to know everything. And just because we checked a box, it doesn't mean that we've done our work. It's ongoing and you progress through horizons, but it's a continuous process.
What was the problem with reducing risk? Or is this around AI risk into opportunity?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that they're What I really wanted to solve was this idea that in my mind, we continue to abstract a lot of what it is that we are trying to address with technology. So data is an abstraction of real life. The architectures that we design are abstractions, and those are helpful. We need to abstract in order to manage reality in this way. But I do think there's a point at which one needs to recognize, okay, I need to go back to the ground truth. I need to talk to actual people. I need to understand the context in which this technology is going to be used so that we're not just building abstractions on top of abstractions, but we're taking time to reground ourselves in what's observable and that kind of thing. And I think that is where we get technology that actually solves problems versus kind of just over-engineering solutions for the sake of doing it.
But this is probably a good point then, now that we've built up all this anticipation, actually to run through these these horizons. And pun absolutely intended there. Do you want to just talk us through the first horizon, which sounds like you sort of touching on it there, grounding the vision? I mean, it sounds simple, but it really is.
Right. And this is my user research lens, coming to the fore. But I think the first step in any kind of problem space is just really understanding what it is that you're trying to solve and for whom. And that part of that is anticipating the risk, because the more you know about those individuals and the potential solutions, the clearer the risk profile becomes, but also improve in their lives. But to do that, you really need to talk to folks, and not just the people who are going to be using the technology, but the people on your teams who are going to be building this technology and carry through your organization's values, your processes, your standards. So it's really a time to reconnect with the human beings who are on either side of this equation and understand what the reality is versus what you might wish it were. I go back to the example of almost shipping a thing without guardrails. That was probably based on an optimistic interpretation of where we thought people were. But once you really start digging in, you learn where there might be discrepancies against the ideal versus the actual. And that's what we want to do in the grounding phase.
And practically then, what does a good grounding look like?
Yeah, I think it's, again, researcher hat, but it's a lot of interviews with folks, with teams. It's really a lot of talking to people. And also in the process of doing that, understanding what concerns people have perhaps about something that they're on the hook to deliver or a solution that they're contemplating, you're going to expose a lot about your organizational culture and values. And that becomes really great raw material for the next phase in the horizon, which is building your foundation. But having those use cases and knowledge of those, how people are applying processes and technology, that's sitting with people, having conversations, having managers collect information from teams and sharing that throughout the organization.
We'll get on to the foundations in a second, but I just wanted to double click on that then, because if a good grounding looks like that, and I think that was clear, sort of the false confidence or a poor grounding, is that simply the absence of that? Or is that the opposite of what you just mentioned?
I think a false confidence can be, now, so this is a good distinction, because as a researcher, do we ever really think we know the answer? I think what we can do is increase our confidence level that we have a handle on the reality, because it is observable, because it's empirically true. We have evidence. Now, we still walk away potentially with hypotheses about this is what we think the current state is, but it is much more informed having gone through the exercise of involving people in the conversation. And I'm being intentionally a bit broad here, but when you're looking to ground, you usually have a problem in front of you. We are looking to adopt AI within our organization. Let's talk to our teams about what does that mean to you? What is that going to change about your workflow? What concerns do you have? What questions? What do you need to be successful? Those are the kinds of things you would ask in that scenario. So not entirely a hand-wavy exercise.
No, and I think that's really valuable and really useful, because one of the things that I see, I mean, I mentioned it before, is boards and senior leadership teams pushing to start building before there is really that much alignment. And in some cases, before there's that much context, sometimes loudly and sometimes urgently. So therefore, a good, clear idea of what that looks like, I think, is very powerful.
Yeah, agree. And that's really the focus. Analogy, if this is helpful for folks, I think about it in terms of doing yoga. I don't know if you do yoga, but a big part of that is grounding yourself, centering your core, getting grounded in your stance, but then reaching beyond sometimes where you even think that you can go. But it starts with being centered in that place. So, and that place to me is with real needs, with real people and the reality on the ground.
Brilliant. Okay, so that you can actually do a gut feel test against that as well then, which is always reassuring.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's move on to the foundation then, because you mentioned the Horizon 2 there very quickly in passing is building the foundation. Now, for me, foundation is one of those things that are unglamorous, but truly essential, as anybody who's tried to build sand on sand will attest to. Very few people get promoted for governance. So what foundations are most often skipped, do you think?
I think the big one, and this is a hard one, but it is that place where values alignment and what people are doing are potentially in conflict because we as an organization have not articulated perhaps our values in a clear way and connected it to the use cases that are at hand. And one of the examples that strikes me in wearing my governance hat was I was asked, what is our opinion on accent mitigation in call center AI interactions? Meaning folks who work at a call center can apply a technology that would mitigate their accent to be more palatable to English speakers. That is a great governance question. How should we make that decision? Partly that's business driven. I think that you could look at revenue and things like that, a customer satisfaction, but there's also perhaps a value or ethics component of that work that if we don't explore, it can cause a little bit of that cognitive dissonance, which translates oftentimes to moving a bit more slowly. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but that's the kind of gap that I think is very difficult because those conversations are hard, but they have demonstrable impact on how teams work.
Okay, what does a good foundation look like then? Clearly there's a technical layer to it, but there's also a set of decisions that come out of a good foundation. So what decisions or decision points do you think are going to be sort of essential to think of in the sort of an acceptable foundation in a generic case?
Yeah, so the things I would start with is kind of collecting that data from the grounding. And I'm going to use the example of AI adoption. Let's just go there because that's the path that we're on. But let's identify where people are using AI within their workflows or would like to. What are they building? How are they building it? So we have this collection of use cases that leadership can look at and say, okay, this is consonant with how we believe our business should be done, or it isn't for reasons. And let's articulate those reasons based on what we are observing so that we can demonstrate through our policies, through how we behave, what we believe is the appropriate way to move forward. So it's not the same thing for everyone, but it is a collection of use cases and policies that are an articulation of what you've learned through the grounding phase and talking to folks on the ground. So the setting the foundations is codifying that a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. So policies, use cases, and being congruent with behaviors and desired or expected behaviors.
Yeah. And let me give you an example, because one of the roles I played while trying to translate between executive intent and on the ground operational building of systems was looking at these use policies that the executive team put out. And in those early drafts, the policies would say things like, employees shall not produce AI outputs that are biased. Well, that is an impossible rule to adhere to because we know these things can output whatever. Now, I think what we were trying to solve for was perpetuating a bias that could be harmful, maybe external to the company or even perhaps internally, but that needs to be articulated. And there were also some very lofty aspirational uses around, we value being energy efficient, being green. That's great to say, but how is that being manifested in how we are delivering technology? Are we favoring using smaller models that are less energy intensive, for example, to really live that principle? And if you don't have those sorts of crosswalks and tied to actual examples, people just tend to disregard the policy. So it's like, oh, that's just, that governance thing I have to check the box on, and let's not let it get in the way, and which is unfortunate.
Indeed, yeah. And it kind of undermines some of the other pieces, which leads me quite nicely onto my next question, which a missing foundation that would have caused the most downstream pain. What would you say was the culprit there?
That's a really excellent question. One foundation missing. I think, again, I come back to ambiguity around values. I think that is because it can undermine teams' confidence that leadership is looking out for them, looking out for the end users. That's kind of a morale killer to be working on something that you might find of questionable utility or violation of some kind of principle that you believed that your organization was striving toward. And that kind of cognitive dissonance, that friction when deploying technology, it slows things down. People debate things. They don't feel good about it. But rushing to an arbitrary deadline is easy to put on paper in a way that making sure that we're truing up to user value, our organizational guidelines, that's just more difficult.
Absolutely. And so then I think we're going to move on to designing and deploying. But one of the things I want to talk about is foresight, because that's one of the key things that you have as an element in there. And, this is one of these things that I think is very difficult in the product world in trying to anticipate the challenges that are going on. I mean, I myself have built platforms, built systems where we sort of thought, we know what we're going. We've got a good idea of where we're going. And then we get down the line and sort of realize fundamental assumption we had, not true. I mean, one example is that I built a decision support system and it essentially helped them with financial information so they could make a better decision about who to take on as a customer, for example. But we massively overestimated the amount of financial literacy that most company leaders have in smaller businesses. And we had to sort of radically rethink and get simpler. So foresight in designing and deploying, big challenge. I mean, for me, this is where a lot of things often go wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, and they will go wrong. I actually appreciate you sharing that story because that is, I think, the lived reality of most people in tech. Things don't go as expected. But I still suspect that we have this expectation that things should go as we expect. And that is where I think the overconfidence and the danger sort of comes in. So I love that example. And the way that I have grappled with that as a researcher is we look at what has to be true for this technology to be considered successful. And also, if it were to go astray, what would that look like? And then you can explore that through research methods with users to assess the most severe potential harmful outcomes and or risky assumptions that you're making before you go to build. But that is not what a lot of CTOs want to hear, like, oh, we're going to do a lot of upfront research. But it can be very targeted to exactly those high risk unknowns, like what you're talking about. If only we had known the financial literacy of these folks. Well, that's something that you can assess if you identify that as a dependency early on in the process.
And so that brings us on then to Horizon 3, which is designing and deploying with Foresight, which is the key bit there. And that is essentially so that you have mitigated or de-risked those big risks. But as you say, you need to identify those first. What pragmatically do you often do? Is that a pre-mortem? Is that this step you're talking about of this sort of empathy with our target users, our target audience first? Is it as straightforward as that before you go into the design and build phase? Or is there something a bit more structured to it than that?
I have developed a structure for Foresight, but again, there's many ways that you can do this. I think the most critical piece is to be creative thinking about risk. And I think that's very uncomfortable. To bring up an uncomfortable bit from the news, there has been a lot of reports and lawsuits involving families of young folks who have become over-reliant on these general purpose chatbots for therapeutic purposes, and they've harmed themselves. And I don't think it takes a lot of vivid imagination to know that that was going to be an outcome of a technology designed to mimic relationships with people. This goes back to social media, other examples. So it's taking that pause and being brave enough to think about the worst case scenarios as often the step that we miss because it's deeply uncomfortable. But on the flip side, to move forward with the confidence knowing, we did the best that we could to mitigate this thing that we know could be out there. The benefits outweigh the risks as we've explored. And now we can monitor for when things start to look like they might be trending toward a dangerous place. And we can be proactive about ensuring that doesn't happen. Now, if you skip that step, you'll never know what to monitor for until people are actually harmed. So that's just kind of an example where that comes into play. So I have developed some activities, some structures to walk people through ideating about risk, which is the crux of this Foresight piece.
That sounds like a lot of fun. What's your favorite awkward question to ask teams at this stage?
Awkward question. Let's see. What didn't you think about before you went through this exercise? Awkward because there's probably quite a bit and people have to be a little humble about it. So
yeah, I'm one of those people who's unfortunately famed for sitting in a meeting room, saying very little until I ask that one question that sends the room completely quiet before it then bursts into explosive
what's your question?
It's often those questions. The question that's not been asked is often the elephant in the room. Somebody asks a question, everybody goes, somebody dared to ask the question that nobody's ever asked before. And then suddenly everybody has creative ideas. I find that often unlocks things, but it is often a question that pushes people, that prods people. And I think, when you're trying to think about, in your words, worst case scenarios, I think sometimes you do need to ask a question that pushes people outside our comfort zone, don't you? In order to get to the point where you're thinking, okay, there really is something beyond our expectations. Because I think especially as engineers, we tend to think about the happy path. We tend to think about the golden route through the platform rather than thinking about all the ways in which you can splinter off and go sideways. And if we do, we don't tend to think that far off the golden path. Whereas I think a lot of the things you're talking about are long on knock-on consequences of some of the things that can start off with one simple step off the path, but then perpetuated.
That's right. That's right. Actually, my all-time favorite question, and this is maybe a little more general than provocative, but it's how do you know that's true? Like we just operate on so many assumptions all the time. So when someone confidently asserts something, I think a great question is, well, how do you know that's true? Well, I heard it from this one person. Oh, one person. You can start to really unravel some of these embedded assumptions that could really affect the trajectory of a project. So that's my all-time favorite one. But yes, asking what's the worst thing that can happen is something I commonly do in these sessions, but I ground that on a use case. We're not just sitting around thinking, oh, this is a terrible use of technology. We're afraid to do anything. That's not at all the demeanor or the vibe I want to perpetuate. It's really about taking ownership over what we are delivering. And it's like, here's our users, here's what we know about them and their vulnerabilities and their points of view and how they'll use this in context. Here's our tech stack. We know we're going to have an LLM here, a supervisor there. We're going to have this user interface that'll generally do these things. And I use the NIST AI risk management framework and pull out those trustworthy AI characteristics that they outline. So it's things like robustness, transparency, reliability. And we look at all of those and then we just brainstorm against our use case. How could transparency go astray in this situation? How could robustness go astray? And then we flip the script. We say, okay, well, here's what we know what could happen. How are we going to make sure it doesn't? And that's where you get a lot of creative ideas. We start solutioning in that phase. We modify our technical architectures to build in those safeguards, but it's really grounded in real risks, demonstrable things we've seen in the news, we've seen in our experience, and we've come to sort of a consensus on what the most important ones are, and we've built a roadmap accordingly. I find that to be really thrilling.
Cool. So it is about being pragmatic and not just about going for the sort of the black swan, unlikely or completely outside of our control situations then.
100%. And that is where, Adam, you like to ask, what were some of the missteps you took? Well, early on, I was sort of in the camp of like, oh my gosh, there's so many things to think about. Authentication is a problem with L. I mean, there's all these pitfalls. And I was a little bit stuck in that space until I really learned to home in on use cases and to bring the relevant risks into the picture. And that was much more palatable to our executive team and our delivery teams. And it just resulted in really productive ways forward.
Yeah, those kinds of risks tend to be a lot easier to quantify as well from a financial perspective and therefore from a mitigation perspective.
Absolutely. That's right.
Very pragmatic. And that brings us then on to, because Horizon 3 was designing and deploying. And then the nice thing about this is it doesn't stop at deploying. And I think that's one of those challenges in other organizations. It's deployed, it's done, it's out there, great, finished. Whereas you then go on to scaling with integrity as Horizon 4. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So as you well know, when we put something into the wild, things are going to go astray. We're going to learn a lot about what people like, what they don't like, what's effective, what's not. And that collecting that feedback with intention and building it back into future iterations is really what's going to sustain trust over time. It's one thing to be first to market. It's quite another to reliably execute week after week, month after month to help people achieve what it is we designed the system to do. And if we have done the design and deployment properly, we will know the things that we need to look out for as signals as to whether we're hitting the mark or not. And so part of this is really, there's anticipation of things will be different than we planned and building that in, but also a bit of humility around, we just don't know everything. We can't possibly know everything. So with integrity, let's move forward with our best, most transparent assumptions of what we think will work, and then be open to recalibrating. And that's what I think wins trust and loyalty over time, and ultimately revenue and all those good things that we hope our products achieve.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there looking out for some known markers or some things you've anticipated from early on. Is there anything that you think the CTO should be watching out for before customers shout about it generically in almost all scenarios where we're using or deploying AI?
Whenever the context changes for which your solution was aimed to address, so it could be regulatory changes that might influence maybe different cutoffs that you've programmed into your system. It could be, I was just thinking today about maybe you have an automated way of triaging customer sentiment. And if someone describes your product as 6-7, a few years ago, that would be a nonsense response. But today it's a little different. That's a small example. But it is to say the world around us changes. And so too, these models are going to have to be adjusted accordingly. To what extent, that's very context dependent, but that's one I would flag.
And I think those 4 horizons give a good way of approaching a project. I mean, clearly it's been articulated here around AI, but it looks fairly applicable to quite a few projects. The key question for me is that there's going to be a bunch of people listening who are in roles of influence, CTO, CPO, and they'll have projects already running and in flight. And so my question, is it ever too late to apply these 4 horizons to running projects, ones that are partway through and going?
Yeah, I would argue it is never too late, because essentially what I am advocating for is injecting humanity in through data collection, talking to people, regrounding on what's true. And I don't think there's ever an inappropriate time to do that. I do think there probably are more and less convenient times to do that. So if you've really built out an infrastructure that might be at odds with some newfound reality, then that's going to be quite disruptive. But I think the value of doing it anyway is to then just to know. Someone will find out. It will become apparent if there are these mismatches. So knowing early and being honest about that, and maybe saying, okay, we understand maybe we've got some tech debt acquired from some of these decisions, but going forward, we are going to move in this direction. We will backlog these things, and here's how we're going to organize that backlog based on what we've heard. So I don't think there's ever a time not to ask. It's kind of like saying, is there a good time to take your blinders off? Well, yeah, like any time is good. But yeah, sometimes are easier than others. I advocate for doing that grounding ongoing and early. That is sometimes a contentious position to have, but that is what I have found to be truly effective.
Cool. Okay. It does fit my instinct, actually, because my instinct's always been the earlier that you catch a gap, whether it's in values or in requirements or in any other differences in the system, anytime you catch a gap, the earlier you catch it, the cheaper it's going to be, whether that's in time, money, reputation. So that kind of fits quite cleanly with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that's the perception, though. I will say research is perceived as some kind of lofty overhead, but it's actually, when done well, you are targeting very specific hypotheses. And the more foundational those are, the more value you can extract from that research ongoing into the process. So you have to be pretty strategic about how you do it to be efficient and timely, but it is certainly possible.
Excellent. And if a CTO is listening right now and thinking, oh my God, we're already live, we're already through this, not done any research or not done enough research, where would you recommend that they would start tomorrow? Which horizon would you get them to start at?
I would advise them to find the assumption, the concern, the issue that keeps them up at night, that gives them, if they're having this reaction, there's something that's giving them pause. I would ask them to interrogate that a bit. What is it about this problem that concerns me? And maybe it's asking the 5 whys to get to the root of it, and then go to the grounding phase and actually talk to people and triangulate. Is this worry valid? Is it not? How can I make meaning of this? And do I need to deal with it? Maybe that you don't, but interrogating why you have that gut sense, I think, is a really valuable signal.
Excellent. Yes. Narrow in on that one thing that's giving you pause. And when you've seen leaders applying this 4 Horizon framework, and especially when sort of retrofitting governance or Foresight to something that's already going, are there any mistakes that you've seen regularly when people try and sort of apply this after a project's in flight?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back maybe to a little bit of wishful thinking versus reality. So I use the example of coming up with policies that just don't marry up with how developers actually build and deploy models. So I think that it's really reconciling those disconnects as the key action that you need to take, but just really, being honest there.
Jump in and correct me if I get anything wrong or if you think there's anything that needs elaborating. So Horizon 1 was grounding the vision. So therefore we need to know what we're solving, for whom, and that basically involves talking to people and understanding expectations and concerns in any cases.
Yeah, I think you nailed it.
Good so far. Horizon 2 was the foundations then. So making sure you've got a connection to the goal, the policies, the behaviors, the use cases, and the values.
Right. And that is really transparent to others in the organization, whether that is through policy, education, et cetera. But those are foundational elements from which to build. Yeah,
excellent. I think that transparency is a key addition to that as well. Excellent. And then Horizon 3 was to design and deploy with Foresight. And I love this because you said basically be creative about the risks. Think about the worst case use scenarios. And your question was, how do you know that's true? Which I think is a really insightful question to ask people.
Yeah, love it. Yes, thank you.
And then Horizon 4 essentially is to scaling with integrity is the way you described it. Essentially watching, learning and iterating and seeing what AI in the wild actually looks like over time. And then looking out for context changes as well, which I thought was a really good tip for what good looks like versus what not so good or risk looks like, at least anyway.
Yeah, I think you got it. I think we know things are going to go different than what we planned. Let's just operate under that assumption and build it into how we iterate.
Excellent. And if you were advising a CTO today with board pressure, they've got a live AI system, they've got some sort of unease that they can't quite articulate, they're therefore sort of beginning to investigate this one area of unease, what would be sort of the one key tip that you would give them to make sure that as they go through these 4 horizons on that one thing, that they actually get to the point where they end up with that sense of We've got this.
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify, but one of the great things about AI right now is that we can spin up prototypes and visualizations and all kinds of testable artifacts to get in front of people. A hand drawing, like sit and sketch with someone, but really get it in front of someone who will be impacted by the technology and just start from there.
Excellent. Because one of the things I often think about is responsibility about using the right tools at the right time. So even if we pick up some of them late, I think this is a great framework to be applying, because I think pretty much anybody hearing this will probably be hearing it for the first time, even though there are some things in here that make an awful lot of sense, Jill. It does, some of these things are fairly straightforward, but the whole idea of, taking risk in AI projects and turning them into a competitive advantage, I think is something that most people can get behind and see the value in. Just before we wrap up and close, what's one question do you think that every CTO that they should ask themselves before they start their next AI initiative?
Yeah, maybe a good one for this environment is, what are we hurrying up for? What are we moving quickly toward, to put it another way? That might be a good grounding question.
I love that. Jill, where can people find you to carry on the conversation?
Yeah, you can find me all over LinkedIn. I'm on YouTube. My site, saddlestitchconsulting.com. What a mouthful. It has a lot of information and ways to reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk to anyone.
Brilliant. We'll put some of those links into the show notes afterwards. But I think just to make Saddle Stitch more memorable, can you just explain to us, for those of us who are not that clear on bookmaking, what is a saddle stitch? It's a simple binding used for pamphlets. And really the gist of it is, yes, it's a nod to my librarian background, but it's also a way of bringing things together, which is what I really love about technology. Its ability to kind of cross a lot of boundaries and bring people and solutions together and so forth. So it's a very extensible metaphor. Excellent. I love that. Jill, thank you very much. It's been one of those conversations that doesn't just inform, it really calibrates how we think. So I think a lot of CTOs are going to be listening to this with some pause and applying some of this. So thank you very much. Glad to hear it. Thank you, Adam. It's my pleasure. Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.